is having a good morning. Let's do the news. Let's start. Um, this is getting somewhat worrying from the standpoint of foreign policy, but let's talk about it. Mike Pompeo, the gentleman in the background, has just put the world on notice, and the United States will now sanction its allies, people who we are supposed to be friends with. It will now sanction them. If you remember, the United States blew off the nuclear deal, the Iranian nuclear deal. Now, it unilaterally blew this off against, for the most part, the entirety of the rest of the world. A deal that was working blew it off. Now, this immediately put the rest of the world on notice. If the United States can unilaterally blow off a deal like this, pass sanctions unilaterally, and expect the world to abide by those sanctions. Imagine for the moment that China passes a sanction on an ally of the United States and then looks at the United States crazily, believing that the United States is somehow going to uphold sanctions that China unilaterally implemented. It couldn't do it if it wanted to, meaning China couldn't do anything about it if it wanted to. Fact of the matter is, this issue is showing the status that the rest of the world has allowed themselves to be put in. The U.S. unilaterally tells the rest of the world what they should do from the standpoint of foreign policy. And that is essentially what has taken place. The U.S. has warned multiple countries that the waiver that it was given on the sanctions for Iran will expire, and it will not be giving additional waivers. Now, the fact that it had to give a waiver in the first place, think about this. China plead, hey, can you give me a waiver? Can you do us a favor and give us a waiver for the unilateral sanctions that you yourself are passing, that we, as a sovereign nation, for whatever reason, have to abide by? It has to abide by because, again, the United States dollar is a reserve currency, and the only place you're going to get dollars is the United States. This gives the U.S. leverage from the standpoint of the financial markets of the various countries. So it allows us to say stuff like Pompeo is about to say. And by the way, before we get to what Pompeo is about to say, just remember who Mike Pompeo is. Listen to what Mike Pompeo says here, because I think anything else that Mike Pompeo says needs to be put in the context of what he's about to say. He's about to tell you something that's infinitely true, and you should take him at his word for something like this, because there's no reason to disbelieve him on this front.
And this was what day?
This was yesterday.
Yesterday. So this is fresh.
Yes.
Okay, here's Secretary of State Mike Pompeo.
In terms of how you think about problem sets, when I was a cadet, what's the cadet motto at West Point? You will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. I was the CI director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses.
They clapped. They clapped at that. A man just said, I have no integrity at all. Zero integrity. That's me, Mike Pompeo. And those guppies, yes! He has no integrity. And he's in the head of the United States running foreign policy. That's totally something you should clap and cheer on. Fucking totally something you should clap and cheer on. That's embarrassing. A human being comes up and says, I have no integrity at all. And people cheer that on as if he's saying something that's just fucking awesome. That's disturbing. That's utterly and entirely disturbing. But that man who has zero integrity, who has just said I curses online to foreign governments and to the American public, now gets out and says this. And says this in a way that he expects you to believe him.
Implemented the strongest pressure campaign in history against the Islamic Republic of Iran. The goal remains simple: to deprive the outlaw regime of the funds it has used to destabilize the Middle East for 4 decades and incentivize Iran to behave like a normal country. Up to 40% of the regime's...
Just so we're clear, destabilize the country for the last decades, the Middle East for the last decades. The United States went into Iraq, destroyed that country, not to mention putting money and resources into the Middle East in order to radicalize elements of the Middle East, of Afghanistan, because it believed that these guys would fight harder against the Soviets. This is us intruding into foreign affairs in the Middle East for 40 years. Not to mention, again, the war in Iraq, the destruction of Libya, the resources in Syria, paying terrorists in order to undermine the governments. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? But again, this is the same Mike Pompeo who said he taught courses in lying, cheating, and stealing. So we don't expect him to be earnest on this. We expect him to be a bullshitter. That's exactly what he's doing here. Let him finish.
Revenue comes from oil sales. It's the regime's number one source of cash. Before our sanctions went into effect, Iran would generate as much as $50 billion annually in oil revenue. Overall, to date, we estimate that our sanctions have denied the regime well north of $10 billion. The regime would have used that money to support terror groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and continue its missile development in defiance of UN Security Council Resolution 2231.
Iran was found to be complying with the deal. Whatever you want to think, Iran was found to be complying with the nuclear deal. The people who weren't in compliance with the nuclear deal was us, because we unilaterally scrubbed the deal. So if you're going to have any notion of Iran did this or that, well, at the very least, let's deal with the fact that the rest of the country or the rest of the world found that they were in compliance. Also, Hillary Clinton, in the WikiLeaks documents, even though she was taking a ton of money from Saudi Arabia, admits that these guys are spreading terrorism throughout the globe. Our allies just beheaded 30-something people and put those head on spikes. Now, these guys are also the guys who carved up Khashoggi in this kind of mob hit where they cut the guy up with a bone saw. And on top of that, these are also the guys that are waging a brutal, bloody war on Yemen that we ourselves are assisting. Essentially the widespread murder of civilians. If you're going to have a conversation with me about what Iran is doing, we need to, at the very least, acknowledge the other points as being true. Let's let him keep going. I'm sorry. I don't mean continuously interrupt, but God, he lies so much. It just fluently comes out of him. I don't even think he thinks secondary about it. As if there is no issue with him lying to the public in the way that he's lying to the public. And the rest of the world knows that he's lying. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Let's let him keep going.
And it would have perpetuated the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Our goal has been to get countries to cease importing Iranian oil entirely. Last November, we granted exemptions from our sanctions to 7 countries and to Taiwan. With this is to give our allies and partners to wean themselves off of Iranian oil and to assure a well-supplied oil market. Today, I'm announcing that we will no longer grant any exemptions. We're going to zero across the board. We will continue to enforce sanctions and monitor compliance. Any nation or entity interacting with Iran should do its diligence and err on the side of caution. The risks are simply not going to be worth the benefits. I want to emphasize that we have used the highest possible care in our decision to ensure market stability. The United States has been in constant discussion with allies and partners to help them transition away from Iranian crude to other alternatives. And we've been working with major oil-producing countries to ensure the market has sufficient volume to minimize the impact on pricing.
Essentially, he's worked with Saudi Arabia and the AUE, Arab Emirates, to get them to pump more oil. That's basically what he's saying. We're going to get them to pump more oil to compensate for the oil that Iran supposedly is not going to be producing or not going to be giving to the rest of the world. Look, China balked at this. Of course they're going to balk at this. Turkey balked at this. some of the other smaller countries like Greece are trying to get themselves off, meaning canceling contracts and moving their oil to other sources. Part of the reason, you can almost make the case of saying that, is it possible that part of the reason the United States wants to get its hand on Venezuela is in order to, again, edge out Iran? Understand the politics that's been taking place here recently. The United States has become a world oil producer, meaning because of fracking, we've become part of the oil markets. And we've been flooding the world with oil markets, dropping the price of oil. And dropping the price of oil, countries that depend on oil prices like Venezuela or Iran, of course, take a hit. Venezuela and Iran. Part of Venezuela's issue is because it was completely dependent upon the oil price. Their government was completely dependent upon the oil price. It wasn't socialism. You might call it bad mismanagement, but it's what it is. They jumped on the opportunity to go after them once that took place. In this case with Iran, they're trying to say, look, we're going to find other sources of oil in order to compensate. That's basically what he's saying here. But again, they've already worked with Saudi Arabia in order to do this. But you might have noticed that oil prices still have gone up. Oil prices have gone up significantly over the last few weeks, especially after hearing news like this. They even have it right here. Brent crude. They're showing the price of crude oil. Or that may not be crude oil, but the barrels, the price of oil has gone up on news like this. Iran has come out and said, we may block the Strait of Hormuz. Now, you may not know what that is, but that's the area where 30% of the world's oil go through. If there is a conflict there, that can be somewhat of a problem. These are going to have real world politics. Let's let them finish.
Both the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and...
Oh, and by the way, the sanctions are doing more than just stopping oil. It's also stopping medicine, supplies, and those type of things from getting into Iran. Sanctions, when it was applied to Iraq, killed 500,000 kids. Remember that. And when you remember that, also understand the reasons that we're doing this. It's not because, let's be very clear. This is them prioritizing a regime change. It's not the rest of the world doing it. The rest of the world is against them doing it. This is the United States, once again, unilaterally pushing for regime change. Let's see here.
And the United Arab Emirates have assured us they will ensure an appropriate supply for the markets. And of course, the United States is now a significant producer as well. I can confirm that each of those suppliers are working directly with Iran's former customers to make the transition away from Iranian crude less disruptive. And
by the way, one more point. Increasing the price of oil benefits Saudi Arabia because it increases the price of oil. They're a major oil producing nation. All of the other countries that the United States, which are allies of the United States, essentially, and my point is this, using foreign policy to benefit markets. That's what's taking place here also. Let's keep going.
As I said, we're doing our part here in the United States too. In 2018, crude production increased by 1.6 million barrels per day over the 2017 levels. And the U.S. Energy Information is very clear to the Ayatollah and his cronies. End your pursuit of nuclear weapons. Stop testing and proliferating ballistic missiles. Stop sponsoring and committing terrorism. Halt the arbitrary detention of U.S. citizens. Our pressure is aimed at fulfilling these demands and others, and it will continue to accelerate until Iran is willing to address them at the negotiating table.
I'm always amazed when I hear somebody giving a story like this. I mean, for one, again, let's be very clear that Iran was complying with the deal, that the rest of the world, for the most part, gave them the gold star compliance on that particular deal, and that the people or the person who pulled out was Trump. Let's be clear on that. Also, let's be clear on this point that Iran was a democratic country at one point. The problem with Iran was that it was a democratic country at one point. The United States worked with Britain in order to undermine that government and get that guy out of office, essentially foment a coup, and then put in their strongman, the strongman that was perfectly willing to make any deal on the oil that they wanted. Iran just wanted a fair shake with regards to oil. That's all they wanted. Hey, maybe we should control our resource and use this resource for the benefit of the people in this country, which freaked out the rest of the world. And the rest of the world said, hell no. Same thing happened with Iraq. When the guy got in, that was more egalitarian. And again, this oil is going to be used for the people of this country. They freaked out. Supported the Ba'athist Party. Should the world be able to, should the United States be able to put the world on notice in a unilateral way? And again, the reason that the U.S. can do this is because it's a reserve currency. European powers are trying to find ways or backdoors in order to go around the United States on this point. I guarantee you this, that the first opportunity they get, they will be working feverishly to find ways to mitigate this. No foreign country is going to want themselves dictated to by the United States. They're not going to want it. Particularly China. Especially China. Back during, and I'll end it on this, back during World War I, during the time those countries were getting extraordinarily militaristic. And I do have a point. My point here is involving Iraq and the similarities with Iraq. And asking the basic question, are the countries going to be with the U.S. again on this? Because that's essentially what this is leading. During World War I, many of these world powers, and everybody knows at this point, these guys had these military contracts. These guys were idolizing military efforts and so forth. And so when the opportunity came up, it was kind of a powder keg. Countries that idolize military service now gets the opportunity to be in military service. But there's also this dynamic that Germany was somewhat of an upstart. You had internal politics of the various countries also that was leading into this thing of war. These countries get involved in war. Archduke Ferdinand gets shot. Now, I want to talk about the internal dynamics of this, meaning the politics of Austro-Hungarian Empire. That empire doesn't exist anymore. But at the time, they were a big shit on the world stage. He gets shot. Now, they knew that Serbia had nothing to do with this. But the internal politics of Serbia, of Austro-Hungarian Empire, said, we don't want anybody else getting to the point of challenging us. We will have no other forces in this world. Meaning, in this region of the world, we would not allow any other force that can come up that rivals us, this empire. Sounds familiar? Yeah, that's the United States doctrine right now. That means that it positions these countries to be in militaristic opposition to various countries that are coming up, upstarts. Our goal is to stop any other country from getting anywhere near us. And so that was their policy. Serbia was one of those countries. So when Archduke Ferdinand was shot, this was the potential, the opportunity to teach them a lesson and break them down to size. And their thing was, they knew it. The historical record shows that they knew that Serbia had nothing to do with it, that the guy acted on his own, but they took the policy, overt policy, as if they did not know. And they blamed Serbia for this. And they gave all of these things that Serbia had to do to be in compliance so we wouldn't go to war. And some of those things ran roughshod over the entire notion of sovereignty in and of itself. They agree with everything with the exception of the items that deal with sovereignty, meaning you're not going to, your courts are not going to be, dominant over our own. We're a sovereign nation. This led to war. Germany didn't necessarily want to be involved in this war. That's the key point in this. Germany was attaching itself to Austro-Hungarian Empire, who just so happened was working with dirty hands. They wanted the war. Germany was just their ally. In the same way that the United States went to war with Iraq, the United States wanted the war. Britain was just an ally of the United States that went along with it. I'm asking this basic question of how many allies are going to go along with the United States if there's any kind of attack on Iran. Israel is pushing for it. Saudi Arabia is pushing for it. The bedfellows of the United States are game. European nations are not. Is Britain going to be so on the cuff or on the tip to jump on board for this? Or some of the other lapdog European nations going to be on board for going into this? Like, I'm asking a basic question of the world is put on notice. The United States is literally telling the world that it needs to do something, that the U.S. has unilateral power in order to force the world to do something. And in this particular case, all eyes are on Iran, where the United States is openly trying to change the government of that country. If some pretext happens, say they shut down the Strait of Hormuz, say they attack Israel, say whatever. I mean, they've been provoked continuously, so say they act on one of the provocations. What happens with the rest of the world? Do they stand by? Do they say nothing? Do they allow this to go on in the same way that the Iraq War was allowed to go on? First, the murder of 500,000 kids through sanctions, and then followed up by essentially a massacre. What does the rest of the world do? I'll leave this here, but Pompeo is now sanctioning allies. That is the key point to take away from this. And let's see what the rest of the world does. Like I said, China balked at this. And I'll just read it. But Pompeo said it all himself. President Trump will not renew special waivers that will have allowed Japan, China, India, Turkey, and South Korea to import oil from Iran without running afoul of renewed U.S. sanctions. The White House announced Monday the waivers are set to expire in early May. So, I will leave this here. Alright guys, if you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through PayPal or Patreon. Thanks all.